You know, when I was a young Christian, a couple of years ago, I tried to imagine what it would be like to be where I am today. I figured that by the time I reached 50, I'd have everything worked out. I figured that my faith would be so strong that it would be just oblivious to anything that was going on around me. It would be just absolutely rock solid. I figured that I would just be oozing the love of Jesus wherever I went. I remember sitting down at one stage, right back in the early days, and starting to write down all of my life goals. And they all revolved around achieving certain milestones in my church career. Now, I wouldn't have put it that way back then. It was kind of like, I figured by the time I'm this age, I want to see this happen. By the time I'm that age, I want to see that happen. And I went through my whole life up until around about 50 years of age, and I had all these things mapped out. I thought, I want to see that, I want to see that, I want to see that. I used to pray earlier on, God, take me as far and as fast as you possibly can. I don't care what it costs. I just want to grow as quickly as possible. It was the only time, back in those days, it was the only time in my life that I was absolutely certain about what my future would look like. I had no idea what was up ahead. I decided to follow Jesus with everything that I had while serving in the army back in 1985. I was discharged in 86. I went along to Bible college at the start of 87. I did 2 years of Bible college and I left for Tasmania at the beginning of 89, thinking that I was going to change the world. Thinking that everything would just fall into place because if you've got faith, that's what's supposed to happen. I helped plant a church here in Belrive, completed a Bachelor of Education at UTAS, met Deb and got married, all in the space of 5 years. We then moved to Brisbane in 94, where I took on the role of youth pastor at Albany Hills Christian Church and also started working 4 days a week at a local school. I went full-time at the church in 96, and then in late 97, with 2 young children in tow, we moved up to Townsville, where we took on the position of senior pastors at Northern Beaches Community Church. During that time that we were in Townsville, we purchased 30 acres of land and saw the church grow from 50 people to nearly 200. We were there for 4 years before moving back down to Tasmania mid-2001. We now had 3 children in tow. When we moved back to Tassie, I set up a web design business and also started working for Grace part-time as the associate pastor. And then in 2004, I took over from Ron as the senior pastor, and I lost one of my younger sisters to cancer that same year. We then added Erin to our family at the end of the year. She was on sale at Woolies at the time, and the Cottuli household was complete. Since then, I remained in the same role, senior pastor, through till today. I've served as a state president for our movement. We've sold our building in the city that we had and moved the church across the river, only to hang around in Mornington for 5.5 years waiting for the next door to open. At the end of 2015, we bought the Ropey Village Green Tavern and started the process of converting it into a meeting hub for our community. And we're learning what it means to love and serve our community the way Jesus does, without any strings attached. Now, when I read through that list of events, there's still plenty of highlights that I've missed out, but anyone listening probably thinks that's not a bad run. Having lived it, though, the experience wasn't nearly as good as it sounds. All right, we'll all go home right now. That's an encouraging thing to say. The experience wasn't nearly as good as it sounds. There were numerous occasions where things could have gone completely pear-shaped, and if they had, I wouldn't be standing here preaching this morning. To say that I had any idea of what the future would hold when I started my walk with Jesus 36 years ago would be a complete fabrication. I had absolutely no idea of the number of valleys that were going to be part of my journey. All I could see from my vantage point of youth were the mountain tops in the far distance. I couldn't see the valleys in between. However, it was the experience that I gained in the valleys that gave me the endurance that I needed to climb the next mountain. What did James say? He said, "Count it all joy when you face troubles of all kinds, because it enables endurance to grow." Without the experience gained during the journey, I would never have reached any of the mountaintops I've been privileged to enjoy. Mountaintops very rarely change you, but the valleys always do. What did the valleys do to me? They shattered the picture that I had of myself and where I thought I'd end up in the future, and destroyed the confidence that I had in my own strength to bring it about. And that was a very, very good thing. You know, we need to get over our fear of failure and weakness, because it can actually lead us to something very, very precious: an understanding and acceptance of God's grace and love toward us. Moses has an amazing story. Moses is a figure from the Old Testament in your Bible, and his story gets taken up in the book of Exodus. Moses was born either 350 or 130 years, depends on how you do your maths, after the Israelites had first moved to Egypt under the leadership of Jacob to be with one of Jacob's young sons, Joseph, who was the second in charge of Egypt at the time. Their population had then exploded, and by the time Moses was born, quite a number of generations had passed, and the Egyptians had forgotten about Joseph and the good that he'd done for their nation. And because the Israelites were so numerous, that there were actually more Israelites than there were Egyptians. Because they were so numerous, the Egyptians, out of fear, began to oppress them and basically treated them as slaves. Now, Pharaoh passed an edict that every Hebrew child born was to be put to death, was to be cast into the Nile River. And Moses was born during that time. About this time, a man and woman from the tribe of Levi got married. The woman became pregnant and gave birth to a son. She saw that he was a special baby, as all parents think their children are special. Some children are more special than others. And kept him hidden for 3 months. But when she could no longer hide him, she got a basket made of papyrus reeds and waterproofed it with tar and pitch. She put the baby in the basket and laid it among the reeds along the bank of the Nile River. The baby's sister then stood at a distance, watching to see what would happen to him. Whenever I read this, I'm thinking she's standing there waiting to see if a crocodile come and eat the baby, her little brother. It's like, so the baby sister then stood at a distance, watching to see what would happen to him. Soon, Pharaoh's daughter came down to bathe in the river, and her attendants walked along the riverbank. When the princess saw the basket among the reeds, she sent her maid to get it for her. When the princess opened it, she saw the baby. The little boy was crying, and she felt sorry for him. "This must be one of the Hebrew children," she said. Then the baby's sister approached the princess. "Should I go?" She was a really cluey kid, this one. She said, "Should I go and find one of the Hebrew women to nurse the baby for you?" she asked. "Yes, do," the princess replied. So the girl went and called the baby's mother, her mum. "Take this baby and nurse him for me," the princess told the baby's mother. "I will pay you for your help." This is the first recorded incidence of child allowance being paid to somebody by the government to look after their child. So the woman took her baby home and nursed him. Later, when the boy was older, his mother brought him back to Pharaoh's daughter, who adopted him as her own son. The princess named him Moses, for she explained, "I lifted him out of the water." Now, when Moses was growing up, just imagine, Moses growing up in Pharaoh's household, I'm sure he felt that he'd been brought into the kingdom for such a time as this. His real family, his Hebrew family, would have made it really clear to him right from a young age that he could actually be his nation's deliverer out of slavery, and that his position in Pharaoh's household was obviously a gift from Yahweh, an opportunity from Yahweh. But any hope he had of that happening came crashing down when he took matters into his own hands and killed an Egyptian overseer forcing him to flee for his life into the desert, where he meets a young lady, marries her, and then works for his father-in-law for the next 40 years, looking after his father-in-law's sheep. So he went from the top of society to pretty well close to the bottom. I'm sure most sheep farmers wouldn't think they're down in the bottom, but back in those days, he went from the top right down to the bottom. He's a fugitive, away from his family, living in the wilderness. By the time God appeared to him in a burning bush, the stars had definitely dimmed in Moses' eyes, and yet it was at that point that God was finally able to use him to deliver the nation of Israel out of slavery and take them on a journey which would culminate in them settling in the land that God had previously promised to their ancestor Abraham. What was the change that took place in Moses' life? In Acts chapter 7, verse 22, Stephen, when talking about Moses, said that Moses was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and was powerful in speech and action. And yet in Exodus, when we pick the story up in chapter 3, after 40 years hiding in the desert, it's another story altogether. This confident young man who was mighty in deed, mighty in action, and mighty with his words, with his spoken word, is a shadow of his former self. And in Exodus chapter 3, verse 11, God's appeared to Moses. He's speaking to him out of a burning bush. He's having this incredible experience. I mean, I've never had a burning bush talk to me. But he's out there, this burning bush. He's hearing God speak to him. God is present. And yet Moses argues with God. God says to Moses, I'm going to use you to deliver the Israelites. And Moses says in verse 11, but Moses protested to God, who am I to appear before Pharaoh? Who am I to lead the people of Israel out of Egypt? When he was younger, he thought he could do it. Now, at the age of 80, he's saying, who am I? I tried, and it didn't go all that well. And then in verse 13, but Moses protested, because God sort of answers him. But Moses protested, if I go to the people of Israel and tell them the God of your ancestors has sent me to you, they will ask me, what is his name? Then what should I tell them? So he's coming up with all these excuses. And then in Exodus 4, verse 1, but Moses protested again. What if they won't believe me or listen to me? What if they say the Lord never appeared to you? And then in verse 10 and 11, through to 13. But Moses pleaded with the Lord, O Lord, I'm not very good with words. I never have been. That's a lie. And I'm not now, even though you have spoken to me. I get tongue-tied and my words get tangled. I think he's explained himself pretty well. But he's saying to God, I get tongue-tied and I can't speak. Then the Lord asked Moses, who makes a person's mouth? Who decides whether people speak or do not speak, hear or do not hear, see or do not see? Is it not I, the Lord? Now go, I will be with you as you speak, and I will instruct you in what to say. Now imagine if God was to say that to you. He says, I want you to be the next Premier of Tasmania. You're going, far out, I can't do that. God said, it doesn't matter. I'm going to go with you. I'm going to tell you exactly what you need to say. I'm going to be with you every step of the way. I'm here. Now, I'm sure most of you go, okay, God, sign me up. I'm there. Moses is still arguing with God at this point. And he says, Lord, please send anyone else. And God relents. And he said, and God relented and said he could take Aaron along with him as his mouthpiece. When Moses was young, he believed that God could use him to deliver the Israelites out of slavery. However, his life took an unexpected turn and his identity and confidence was shattered. Then God began to rebuild it. And later, in Exodus, we see Moses speaking directly to Pharaoh without the need of Aaron to shield him. You see, the way Moses viewed himself changed radically in the 40 years that he spent in the desert. And the focus of his confidence shifted from his own strength to God's. That was a very long valley. That was a very long valley. But then the task that God had for him was extraordinary. Paul, the Apostle Paul, was on a trajectory to the top when Jesus broke into his world. A Pharisee among Pharisees, a leading light amongst his contemporaries. Paul had no idea that the direction his life would take would be totally derailed by an encounter with Jesus on the road to Damascus. He went from being a rising star to being persecuted by the same religious authorities he thought he would one day be leading in his future. This is what Paul had to say toward the end of his life in Philippians 3. He said, I was circumcised when I was 8 days old. I'm a pure-blooded citizen of Israel and a member of the tribe of Benjamin, a real Hebrew, if there ever was one. I was a member of the Pharisees who demand the strictest obedience to the Jewish law. I was so zealous that I harshly persecuted the church, and as for righteousness, I obeyed the law without fault. Paul thought he was doing God's will. Paul thought he was on the right track. Paul had his future mapped out for him in his mind, and he thought that God was with him to see that future come to pass. And then Jesus steps into the middle of his journey, life journey, and totally smashes him. Can you imagine what it'd be like for a young guy who thinks he's serving God and he's incredibly diligent? He's there at everything that's going on. I mean, he studies really hard. He's a great thinking young man. He's really, when people look at him, they say to their kids, you know, you could be like Paul. You know, if you were like him, things would be a lot better at home. If you were like that other kid down the road there. I mean, he was an example to those around him. He was a leader of his generation. And he thought he was doing it all for God. And yet, somehow, Paul, the great thinker, completely missed the fact that he was persecuting the followers of the Jewish Messiah. See, the Pharisees were waiting for the Messiah to come. And they, or Paul, I'm sure, assumed that he would be really aware when the Messiah arrived. And yet, in spite of all of his effort, in spite of all of his intelligence, in spite of all of his training and study, he completely missed the Messiah. In fact, he started to persecute the followers of the Jewish Messiah and was getting them thrown into jail and was probably responsible for the death of some of them. And all of a sudden he finds out that he had it totally wrong. He then goes on and says in Philippians, I once thought these things were valuable, but now I consider them worthless because of what Christ has done. I used to gain my sense of identity through this stuff that I had achieved in the past, but now I think they're all worthless because of what Christ has done. Yes, everything else is worthless when compared with the infinite value of knowing Christ Jesus my Lord. For his sake I've discarded everything else, counting it all as garbage, so that I could gain Christ and become one with him. Between Paul's days as a Pharisee and his writing of the letter to the Philippians, a huge shift had occurred in his heart and his thinking. Paul was an extremely capable person, but then he had an encounter with Jesus that changed his priorities and his very nature at a fundamental level. Paul's identity and confidence was shattered and then rebuilt by Jesus over the course of the rest of his life. What can we take from the story of these two biblical characters? Firstly, don't take yourself too seriously, especially when you start now, because God may have to do some breaking and remaking in the journey of your life. And if you're too invested in being a self-made hero, too invested in the picture of your preferred future, you'll very likely end up experiencing a fair amount of pain that you possibly could have avoided. Actually, when I was writing that bit about you could possibly have avoided, I actually don't think that in life that you can actually avoid pain. I don't think you can avoid suffering. I used to, I used to think if I knew what I know now and was able to jump back to the beginning of my life, I would just not make certain decisions. It would be so much easier because I know what the outcome of it was. The reality of it is that if I knew what I know now back when I started, yeah, I may not have made those mistakes, but I would have made others. Because I was the same, I would still be the same person I was back then, and the person I was back then needed to change to be the person I am now. And listen, you don't change when things are going well. You just enjoy the ride. You only change when things aren't going well in your life. You only really deeply think about, some of you might think that you think deeply about things. It's easy to think deeply about things, I suppose, if you're kind of having a conversation with some of your friends and you're trying to work out the meaning of the existence and the universe and all that sort of stuff. But I tell you what, when you really think deeply about things is when you are just incredibly torn apart on the inside because a relationship that is really important to you isn't working out well, and everything inside of you wants to just give it the flick and pull out, and yet inside of you there's this thought that no, I should stay, I should stick this out because that's what Jesus has told me to do. He's told me to love people. He's told me to lay my life down for others. When you're in a situation like that, that's when you really start to think deeply. That's when real change starts to take place inside of you. Not when things are going well. It's when you're going through the rough, difficult times. And I don't know, honestly, I don't know if you can avoid it. If I could teach you a method that you could follow that would avoid pain, I would. Honestly, I think life's tough, and if I could help you avoid pain, I would do that. But Jesus didn't even help his disciples avoid pain. He didn't shelter them from pain. In fact, Jesus said to his disciples, "In this life, you will have lots of trouble. You will be well acquainted with sorrow. But take heart, I've overcome the world." Thanks, Jesus. Jesus didn't try to protect his followers because Jesus realised that for change to happen in a person's life, that things needed to be broken, things needed to be shifted, things needed to be pried out of our fingers, because where Jesus wants to take us is far better than we start off. Secondly, make it a habit to continuously place Jesus at the very centre of your life, and if need be, burn your bridges. Or else you might be tempted to turn back when the going gets too tough. When once again, I was a bit hesitant to put down there about burning your bridges, but then when I was preparing that bit, the picture that I had in my mind was Jesus' disciples. Jesus had just been preaching a message, and a whole heap of people had left him. It was a really bad Sunday. A whole heap of people said, "We're not following him anymore." And Jesus turns to his closest guys, and he says to them, "Well, what about you? Are you going to leave as well?" And Peter, the spokesman of the group, goes, "Well, where the heck would we go? There's no other option. You're the only person who has the words of life." And it was like, when you read that, you're thinking, oh, that was really nice of them to follow Jesus, continue following Jesus. But the reality for them was they didn't have an alternative. If they could find an alternative to following Jesus at that point in time when everybody's deserting him as well, and they're starting to stand out a little bit, we're the only guys that are hanging around, at that point, they could have quite easily have taken a left turn. But they didn't, because in their minds, they had no escape clause. They had no option. There was no other way out. So secondly, make it a habit in your life to continuously place Jesus at the very centre of your life. Because when you're going through pain, when you're going through tough times, Sometimes what is required of you is that you just keep on going. That you just keep on going. That you just keep on persevering. That you remain in that relationship. You remain in that job. You remain where God has planted you until things change. And it's like you've got no option. There's no other option. You can't. So during those times, you need to be constantly looking to Jesus. You need to be constantly looking to where He's going. You need to be constantly listening to His voice. Because His voice constantly says, love them. Love them. Keep on going. It's like, can't you give me something deeper than that? He goes, that's pretty deep, actually. And one day you'll realise that's really deep. Love them. Keep on going. Keep on going. And love them. And as you stay in that place, as you continue to walk through that valley, a transformation starts to happen on the inside of you that you can't buy with money. You've got to live it. You've got to experience it to have it. And then thirdly, if you're humble enough throughout your life to actually live as though Jesus knows best, then you may very well end up living a life that will echo down through eternity. A life that will attract the attention of God and give Him an opportunity to work through you on the earth. In the Old Testament, there's a little phrase, a little passage of Scripture that says, the eyes of the Lord run to and fro across the earth, seeking those whose hearts are perfect toward Him, that He might show Himself strong on their behalf. Stay humble. Believe that Jesus knows best and that you don't. There will be times when you will think, I tell Jesus off all the time, right? But there'll be times when you'll think that you know better than Jesus, and you'll want to explain things to Him and tell Him how He should be doing things in your life. But that never gets you anywhere. Because Jesus is like the dad. You know, come here, and he just sits there and just, with his arms crossed. He just looks at you. He smiles. He says, I've heard this 14,352 million times from all of the other people on the earth who follow me. That's okay. And he's just unfazed. He just listens. Yeah, okay. Just keep loving. Keep on going. I know best. I know best. How amazing would your life be if you managed to continue walking with Him every step of the way? What an amazing legacy your life would be. But it's how you handle the journey that will determine the eulogy that gets read out at your funeral and the welcome that you're going to receive when you enter into eternity. The valleys are far more important than the fleeting time you spend on the mountaintops during your life. Don't give up. Keep walking. Keep moving forward. Keep allowing God's refining love to shape and fashion you. And you will, if you do that, you will eventually become everything that God has planned for you. And I guarantee it will be far, far better than anything you could have ever imagined when you were young, when you had stars in your eyes, when you didn't know any better. If I get the music back, that'd be great. God knows how long it will take. God knows how long it will take to change you. God knows how long the valley that you're currently in is going to take for you to get from one end to the other. And the greatest gift that we can give to God in our lives is the gift of trust. I was just thinking about this, God knows. He already knows the length of your life. He already knows how long the valley's going to last for. And He's asked you to follow along with Him. He's asked you to come along with Him on this journey. And the picture that I get is like a dad and a mum heading out on a 5-hour car trip, and they've got all the kids in the back. And they know it's going to take 5 hours to get to the end. And 20 minutes in, the kids are going, are we there yet? Are we there yet? Because they don't have any concept of how long it's going to take. But they're just going, are we there yet? Or we've been in the car for 20 minutes, we must be nearly there. And every now and again, the parents find a place where they can pull over, grab their kids something from Macca's, an ice cream or something, pull over at the server, get them a meat pie, and the kids, they're like, oh, this is the highlight of this journey. It's stopping at Macca's, or stopping and getting a meat pie. And I actually think that some of the highlights that we think are highlights in our lives, in God's mind, are just like stopping at McDonald's and getting an ice cream, getting a sundae. And we make a big deal. Oh, did you see what happened there? Did you see the playground at that place? That was amazing. Oh, it's a really high slippery dip. But, I think sometimes in God's, He's going, hey, I'm in this with you to the end of your life. I'm taking you on a journey that will span the entirety of your life. We've got a destination that we're heading to. And here's the thing. I talk about leaving a legacy and doing great things with your life. But the reality, you know what the most important thing to God is? Why Jesus came? Why He died on a cross? The most important thing to God isn't necessarily what you achieve in your life. The most important thing to God is getting you to the end of your life and welcoming you into eternity, where you will then be with Him forever. That's God's aim. That's God's end game. Now, the stuff that you do along the way, let's make our lives fruitful. Let's make our lives beneficial to those around us. But in God's mind, when you think about it, what's the one thing that God doesn't have at the moment? He doesn't have this type of relationship that we have with each other, with us. He doesn't have that. That's going to happen when we step out of this plane of existence and go into eternity. And then God's going to be able to see you. He's going to be able to touch you. You think, oh, one day I want to be able to see God, and I want to be able to touch God, and I want to be able to hear God. Think about it from His perspective. You're His child, and He can't put you on His lap. He can't hug you. He can't walk with you on the side of a street and talk to you just the way you talk to your friends. And we go, oh, God talks to us, but listen, let's be realistic. Yeah, God talks to us, yes, He does. But we don't hear Him all that well at times. And sometimes it feels like He's not even there. And yet the Bible says that He will never leave us nor forsake us. But there are times when we as kids, His kids, think, oh, God's not around, God's not here, God's not with me. I don't feel Him, I don't sense Him. Obviously God's left me. Can you imagine how He feels when we feel that way? So for God, the end game is bringing you into eternity, where you'll spend eternity with Him. But you've got this journey that you're on. And along the way, you get to stop off at a few different McDonald's, you get to try out a few different playgrounds. You think, wow, that was great. And God loves it when when we're enjoying life. But He's with you. He'll never leave you nor forsake you. The greatest gift that you can give to Him in this journey of life is trust. Trusting that He loves you. Trusting that He knows best. Trusting that He is with you each step of the way. When you get up in the morning, picture Jesus in your mind and tell Him that you trust Him to get you through this next 24 hours. And for some of you, it's virtually getting through the next 24 hours. You're not even thinking a week ahead. You're not even thinking a month. You're not thinking a few years. You're thinking the next 24 hours. When you get up in the morning, picture Jesus standing there and say to Him, Jesus, I trust you to get me through this next 24 hours. And you will have given Him a gift that He very rarely receives from His kids. Usually what He hears from His kids, are we there yet? I don't want to be in the back with this sibling of mine. They're a pain in the butt. I want to kill them. Can you wind the window down, Dad? Can you pull over? I've just had enough of this road. This road's really boring. I mean, he hears that all the time. But what about the kid who sits in the back and never says, are we there yet? But is just happy? Is just quite, is quiet, Now when you're driving a car, you don't want to have some kid going off in the back seat. But your kid's quiet, they're happy, they're not complaining. When you pull over, they get out, they don't go, oh, we want to stay here. They pop back into the car when they're supposed to get back in the car. When you buy them something, they don't go, oh, I don't want to eat that. They go, oh, this is really good, thanks, Dad. A kid is really appreciative of the fact that you're the one that's doing the driving and they're not having to drive. Can you imagine? Adults, older folk amongst us. Can you imagine if you could be that type of kid to God? Should be. Should be. Because here's the thing. It'll make it much more pleasant for him. Can God get grumpy? Jesus got grumpy with his disciples. You can make life a lot easier for God. But you'll also end up making life a lot easier for yourself. Because all the complaining in the world doesn't change the situations and circumstances that we find ourselves in. You can complain about the valley till the cows come home, but you still got to walk through the crummy thing. You still got to get to the other side. Let's pray.